Good afternoon from London, where IAFOR is currently holding a joint conference on education, arts and humanities, language learning, and aging in gerontology. Next to me is standing Dr. Neelam Raina from Middlesex University. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Could you briefly introduce yourself and tell us what it is that you do?
I am the Director of Research at Middlesex University. I'm also a post-conflict reconstruction expert. I work with women in conflict zones looking at their resilience, their ambition, and their trajectory of development in fragile settings.
And today is the second plenary day of this conference. Can you briefly summarize what you presented?
Today at the keynote I was talking about erased narratives and marginalized spaces within which people who are unequal in many different ways manage to navigate their way around fragility, and how they are left in the margins at all points of time based on their intersectional identities. And I was giving you an example of my own work that has been done under the Gender Justice Security Hub at LSE.
In your presentation, you talked about the middle ground and how this is slowly shrinking. What is the middle ground?
The middle ground is an open space where dialogues of different perspectives can emerge, where there's a safe space for raising questions and answering them without any personal risk. These spaces of dialogue in conflict spaces are erased as conflict erupts, but as conflict de-escalates and fragility re-emerges in these communities, a polarization based on the history of the conflict emerges, and therefore these spaces are shrinking, and the right to freedom of speech or freedom of discussion for all generations is erased. And I was talking about how these spaces have been marginalized and limited and contained and watched and abused in many ways by the powers that be, and how we need to fight to protect that space.
Where did we go wrong?
I think it is more a question of who let us down rather than where we went wrong. I think it's more of a question of what is wrong with these spaces and what is wrong with the powers that be that are afraid of these spaces of dialogue, who do not see the benefit of these spaces to the future generations, which is the work of reconstruction, of rebuilding society post a traumatic event, where there's truth commissions, restorative justice, transitional justice mechanisms in place that allow communities to effectively emerge from that conflict and remain peaceful and start to rebuild their lives and put the conflict behind them.
And now these marginalized people are increasingly becoming more fearful of speaking up. And in your work that you presented today, you identified a way in which we can sneakily try to help them open up and create the safe space for them. Can you elaborate on that?
I think it is the unique perspective that arts and humanities brings into this space. Arts and humanities often portrayed as these fluffy cultural things that people do on the side. However, these things bring dignity, a sense of identity, a sense of belonging, which all get damaged when conflict takes place. And so understanding the value and the approaches that arts and humanities has in this space is what my work has focused on. So today I gave you an example of using arts-based approaches that looked at culturally relevant practices such as handicraft, weaving, song, dance, cinema, which brings joy to people but also brings a sense of ownership, a sense of identity, and a sense of not all is lost. And what is important about these skills and these practices is that they exist in spite of crisis. They don't get erased. They are almost anti-fragile in their nature, and how we need to understand the opportunity cost of using these approaches and allowing dialogue to emerge in a neutral space where communities who have been fractured are actually coming together to talk about things that they have valued forever and ever. And so conflict becomes a time-space object in the middle, but the continuum of these practices and these arts overrides the conflict in place.
You as a researcher have a great responsibility in providing this opportunity for these marginalized voices to be heard. And you must be so unbiased to allow them to speak for themselves and not to embed your own thoughts into this discussion. How can we ensure that researchers keep this unbiased way of operating? How can universities nurture this characteristic in the future researchers?
The quick answer is invest in arts and humanities that allow these spaces to exist. But the long answer is to understand that being biased is part of human nature. Nobody's unbiased. But awareness of those biases and the burdens that we bear of patriarchy on one shoulder and colonial pasts on the other shoulder allow you to understand that everybody shares that burden, and understanding that marginalization and providing of things is a top-down colonial approach, while when you go in the field and use methodologies which have lots written about, things like CPAR, they exist for you to be part of the location, of the field. And the field is not an inert space, the field also moves. And how you're positioning yourself in that space allows you to listen into people's conversations. They have these conversations in smaller, low-scale, contained spaces, but the projects such as this allow you to capture impact of providing that platform on which this conversation can take place without a definitive direction. So there is no extractive element of this, because I am not imposing something that they will then talk about. I am sitting and observing, saying, this is a safe space and let's see what you come up with. And so the conversations of these women are based on what they already know. It's just that they are not documented because A, they are women, B, they are rural, C, it's not in English, D, they are influenced by patriarchal familial relationships which prevent them from airing their opinions and views. And so understanding those inequalities and inequities in that space and creating an open space for that to be understood and put to one side, and then you have a healthy conversation between people who are most impacted, but also those who are agents of change on their own. They are the people who are seeing the risk of the conflict in their daily lives. And so their dialogues are more important than top-down, let's talk about this conversation.
How was your research, was it welcomed by the society that you belong in academically?
In the academic setting, because there are silos and disciplines, I'm often asked if I'm an artist or am I a political scholar, am I a social scientist, am I a behaviorist. I don't want to wear any of those hats because I wear all of them at one time as an interdisciplinary hat, which is quite uncomfortable at all times, because academia is designed along specialism, super specialism and a PhD, and then a department or a faculty you belong to within which you must contain yourself. And so working across faculties, working across discipline areas allows me to step on a lot of toes of people coming to me saying, you have not read this, have you? Yes, I have, but perhaps with a different perspective. Within the academic space, those interdisciplinary spaces are very limited because people like to own what they do and they like to belong to a discipline silo. And that has a limited lifeline. You have to work across disciplines. You have to contribute to disciplines you don't understand to be in that space. So I do stand on a lot of toes, but I was plagued by interloper syndrome for the first 10 years of my research, where I was not able to say who I am and what I do because I could not wear one hat comfortably. It's this multiplicity of approaches and disciplines that becomes chaotic to explain, but they work seamlessly on the ground.
And then my final question is, what is your outlook on your field of research, how it unfolds, how we produce more research regarding indigenous people and women and marginalized people?
How it's unfolding is it's starting to ask slightly radical questions about the future of us as humanity. It's starting to ask questions about failure of those who we placed in responsible spaces to fix things for us, and how they have failed at fixing anything. In fact, we are sliding very slowly into a decline where fragility of conflict and climate are kind of merging. But the nexus conversation on a policy and programming level that happens is not fulfilling what we need, because the space between policy, funding, donor spaces and donor mechanisms, including NATO, who I spoke about this morning, and what is experienced on the ground is so far away that it requires us to, my research is looking at asking radical questions in the middle about who do we value, why do we value it, and how are we trying to move away from these systems that are clearly broken and don't work for anybody but a few. And we need to be able to understand that we have the power to change that. collectively and individually. So that's where it is going as of now.
Very provocative. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you.